So since October 7th, there's been a lot of anger and unrest across college campuses, right? Even some threats of violence and young people feeling like they can't really speak up and offer their thoughts on what's going on. Except one place, Dartmouth College, has been notably different. And last week, Scott Simon did an interview with two professors there to see kind of how they had managed to create in this moment this kind of place where they could teach and learn and they could have open conversation. One of the people was Susanna Heschel. She heads the Judaic Studies program there at Dartmouth. She's the daughter of probably the most famous American rabbi ever, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the other person was an Islamic scholar named Tariq El-Aris, and he heads the Islamic Studies program. And they talked about how immediately after the attack, Tariq was in Egypt, they were on the phone and they said, we have to do something. So they began to plan these programs and forums where people could come together and people could share. And Susanna Heschel offered three kind of little nuggets that I thought, well, that is really helpful for all of our relationships, for all of our potential conflicts, not just here. And she said, for one thing, they were not starting from ground zero. They already had relationships. The Jewish and Islamic studies programs there at Dartmouth had already been doing a lot of programs together. So the professors knew each other, the faculty had this trust, and a lot of the students had already been coming together. So relationships, right, which made it easier to work through difficult things. And then the second thing she said was, we refuse to kind of follow this reductionistic, simplistic approach. We put this in the context, right? Didn't start 1948, got to go back to the British Mandate, got to go back to the 1800s. I mean, they put it in this historical context and refused to be simplistic. And then the third thing she said was, we also tried to talk about a future, a better future. She had just given a talk about the Sabbath, the Shabbat, which is, a foretaste of paradise. And she said, nobody talks about paradise anymore. We're so caught up in the present and the past and the horror of it that no one talks about a future. No one talks about the possibility out there. And she said, and when we do, so often it's punitive. Like so much of the language now is like, people need to be punished. Israel needs to be punished. Hamas needs to be punished. She said, these are human beings. Why do we talk that way? I mean, how helpful is that, right? When we think about our own relationships, having deep relationships and not being simplistic, like, where's the person coming from? What's their history? And thinking about a future, what would we want this relationship to look like eventually? So we come to the parable today. I appreciate the scholars who say this parable is probably a conflation of two stories. Jesus does that sometimes, the gospel writers, like, here's the story of Jesus healing, and here's a story of a controversy on the Sabbath, and the two stories are brought together. So if you read this parable as a conflation, and you follow this feminist scholar, Rosenblatt, then what you might imagine is that the very first core of the parable was paradise, and then the parable that's come to us is about punishment, and there's been an evolution. Read this way, in the first parable, you have these 10 women. 10 is a whole number, right? 10 talents, the 100 sheep that have been found, 10,000 talents, a 10 million. A 10 is a way of saying a lovely, beautiful wholeness, right? So here are these 10 women, and they're at the wedding banquet, which is a symbol for paradise, the beloved community, the day when there's no suffering, and they're attending the bridegroom, which is kind of unusual. You'd think it'd be the men, but it's an example here. This is a feast where everybody is included and no one is left out. And the women with their lamps represent good works, which is kind of what that light does. That's one reading of the first kernel of the parable, which is about paradise. But then she says, as it developed, you get this very different parable, which might be kind of a polemic that was going on in the early church. People were fighting already, maybe some women were talking too much, maybe there was false prophets, and so you get these 5 foolish against the 5 wise. And in this parable, you have the people show up. They're honestly all prepared. All 10 women have shown up with the lamp, thinking that the bridegroom might be delayed and it might go really late. So it's like they've all got their FEMA kit with them, right? But 5 of them, we're told, are foolish because they didn't bring an extra jug of oil. But 5 of them have showed up with extra oil. And then, sure enough, the bridegroom is delayed, and finally he comes, and then the 5 foolish women no longer have any oil. And so they ask the 5 wise women, can you share some of your oil? And in good Jesus fashion, what do they say? No, get your own dadgum oil, right? Like, forget about the Sermon on the Mount earlier, just go down to the market because we don't want to give up any of our oil because we might not have enough. So then the 5 foolish women, they go off to get the oil, and sure enough, while they do, the bridegroom comes, the party starts, and then they return, and what does the bridegroom say? Yeah, no way, you're not coming in here, too late, you should have been awake. So it's not like a lot of the parables, right, where the prodigal son, what happens is welcomed back, right? Or the sheep goes off and strays, and, you go and find it and bring it back. No, this is a parable that ends on a punitive note. We've gone from maybe the original parable that was paradise to now we've got these people who need, these women who are out of line, who are on their motorcycle, who are rowdy, who need to be punished and put in their place. And the question is kind of like, why do we do that? What is that part of us that kind of goes to that place where we kind of go negative? David Remnick is the editor of The New Yorker, Jewish American, quite bright, intelligent man. He went to Israel about a week after the attack in Hamas, and he came back and he wrote a piece that takes an hour to read in The New Yorker, and he wrote it on October 28th, and he resisted any kind of simplistic reading of the situation. I mean, he was traveling with the Israeli army, and they set him down and they showed him, long videotapes of the attacks in Hamas and the barbarity, and he had a lot of interaction with first-person witnesses, and it's the kind of thing that, we're not going to talk about in a place where there are children, right? Because it's the kind of inhumanity that breaks our heart open. We think of other massacres that we know about, whether it's Cambodia, My Lai. We think about how can the human heart do this, right? But Remnick is not simplistic or reductionistic. And so he also talks about the violence that is the daily bread of the Palestinians. And he talked about the West Bank. And when we hear the word settlement, unless you've seen it, this is not people who've moved in with a tent. This is like big subdivisions, big high-rise apartments. So we think of the West Bank, 2 million Palestinians on their land that's occupied, but in recent years, more and more settlements moving in. And the settlers now are 500,000. It's not a small number of people, right, who have encroached on Palestinian land. And then there's the ongoing daily violence of the checkpoints and just the incredible increased violence. So Remnick is not coming at this situation thinking there's an easy fix, but he's also trying to find a way forward. And so in this piece, he talks about a visit he took to a man named Sari Nusseibeh. Sari Nusseibeh is 74. He's an Arabic scholar, Islamist philosopher. His family is kind of one of the oldest Palestinian families by their tradition. They have been in that land for 1,300 years. And 20 years ago, David Remnick interviewed him and wrote a piece, right? So here's this long-term relationship. And he goes to meet with Nusseibeh, and this gentleman who had also been an informer, had been an advisor to Yasser Arafat, and he very much a believer in peace, very much a moderating voice, very much a person who believes there has to be a way forward, who obviously believes the Palestinians need a state, but also believes that he understands Israeli insecurity and fear and panic, right? And in talking to him, one of the things that Nusseibeh said that I thought was so helpful was this: you cannot destroy Hamas. It is not a person. It is not a program. It is a part of the tapestry of Palestinian life that gets bigger and smaller depending on what's going on. It's a sign of people who feel so beleaguered that they will lash out. It's like Hamas cannot be eradicated until what? Until there's a diplomatic solution, until there's land for everyone, until there's hope. That's how you get rid of some kind of terror extreme. And the men talked about, again, terror on the other side. I don't know, probably not many of you, this didn't make our news too much, but it made, like the Times of Israel, on November 1st, the Israeli Knesset appointed a new person in the ministry in the Israeli cabinet to head up the West Bank. This person is such an ultra-nationalist and such an extremist that the Israeli army rejected his service because he's considered such a terrorist figure. So when he was 20, he was accused of arson against a Palestinian, against a mosque. And 2 days before the Hamas attack, 2 days before, he was involved in another violent episode against the Palestinians. And the Israelis have just put this guy who, the Times of Israel, I'm not talking about the Jewish Current or Jewish Voices for Peace folks, I'm talking about the Times of Israel, has said this guy who is now in charge of the West Bank is a terrorist and an arsonist and a very dangerous, one of the most dangerous people in Israel. So Nusabi and Remnick, they're not naive, right, about how quickly we're going to get to paradise. But they're also talking about hope. And Nusabi pointed out that even this day, if you poll the average Israeli and the average Arab, the average Palestinian, what do they say? They want to live in peace. Everybody wants, guess what? Guess what everybody wants? Everybody wants what me and you want, right? Who doesn't want to have a home and have their kids safe, be able to go down the street? I mean, people just want to be able to sit down and eat and raise their crops. He said even after the Camp David peace accords fell apart in 2000, the next few days, 1 million people, Israeli and Arab, got together and signed a 6-point principle thing that they could agree on. 1 million, that's a lot of people standing on the corner gathering signatures, folk, 1 million. There have been so many missed opportunities. I mean, Usabi talked about it, you know, when Arafat and Barak went away, you know, refused. He said, you know, they should have had him back in Camp David the next day, make him stay there, you know. So there have been missed opportunities. But one other piece of hope is that every single time there has been any movement forward in peace, it has come what? After a war, after an intifada. I mean, that has always been, you know, right after the worst, there is a movement for hope. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. So what Nusabi was saying was, in the short term, yeah, things don't look so good. But in the long term, no matter what, people will have to find a way to live together. Despair, he says, is not a luxury that we can afford, right? You have to be a person of hope. You have to look down the road. You have to believe that up ahead, there is another way. And you've got to put your life and put your hope and everything you have behind that. I had forgotten about my visit to Taipei, and that is in many ways the point of the sermon, because Taipei is as close to paradise as any place I've ever seen. It's a little village in the West Bank. When we went there in 2010, it was a very dark time. Not dark like today, but dark. Neither the Israelis or the Palestinians had a leader interested in peace. And I remember it was dark when we went there. It was dark traveling along the road, and it was sort of frightening. There were only a few people along the road. Israeli soldiers aren't heavily armed and checkpoints. But I also remember it was one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. And looking out the window on that dark night, and I can't do it justice, it was like a Christmas card. It was like, you could imagine against the dark night and the little stars in the sky, you could kind of see Mary and Joseph on the donkey. It was just this magical night. And when we got there to this old, beautiful church that had, you know, frescoes painted all over it and candles lit everywhere, there was a little priest named Father Raid. And he was, and I cannot do him justice, he was the stereotypical Arab, like a Disney cartoon. Like back before they kind of cleaned things up and realized, but he was like darting and wiry and small and had these dark glasses, and everywhere he went, he was like, Jesus stood there and Jesus slept there and Jesus ate a pomegranate there. They have a lot of pomegranates there. But to their credit, Taipei is also called Ephraim in the New Testament, and it's where Jesus supposedly stopped after he had raised Lazarus from the dead. So they have a lot of claim to Jesus. And he went on and on like this, you know, here's a piece of pottery that Jesus used, and here's a piece of plate. And of course, all this stuff was for sale. And then there was a craft table, and then there was more, and this and that. But every once in a while, the Father would stop, and he would tell us about the challenges they face, how the checkpoints had made it so difficult, how so many women trying to get through the last year to have a baby, some of the babies who were born right there at the checkpoint, a couple of them didn't live. And so they, in their village, this is the last, one of the very last Christian villages in all of the West Bank, a completely Christian town of just not that many people. But they had opened their own clinic that could treat everybody. It didn't matter what their religious was. And then he talked about how damaging the checkpoints had been to the local economy, that people's fruits and vegetables rotted. And so the only thing people could do really anymore was sell olive oil. And he said, I am swimming in olive oil. He said all the parents, they pay their school fees in olive oil, olive oil, olive oil. He said, I went to France and the EU to try to lift the tariffs so that we could sell olive oil. And he just went on and on and on. And then at the end, we went into the tent, you know, the secret tent. Not everybody gets to go in the secret tent. Smoke and mirrors, literally, I mean literally smoke. They were passing something around for people to smoke. And then when the smoke finally cleared and he began to preach, and you could hear prophets, you could hear the lion and the lamb one day laying together. You could hear the good news to the poor, liberty to captives. You could hear in his words, I have a dream one day the children and slave owners will sit down together. And in his preaching, it began to be really clear what he was trying to sell us. And it was peace. He was trying to sell us the peace that they had found in that village. Their little Christian school, they reserved 1/3 of the seats for Muslim kids. They'd started a choir with Christian and Jewish and Muslim kids, and they toured all over the country. And as he went on and on and on, I thought, I felt it. I felt this sense of peace. And he literally was trying to sell us peace because he had these peace doves that they had begun making. And he wanted all of us to take some peace doves back, and I did. And I gave them that year to the college kids and the high school kids. He wanted us to take quite a few because their goal in this little village was to sell 100,000 peace doves. They wanted these peace doves all over the country, all over the world, because they believed then that the lights would go up into heaven and God would see it, and God would have to give the people peace. And he thought the people will be so busy entertaining all the people who come to Taipei to see it, that nobody will ever be able to have war again. I can't do it justice, but I can only deliver to you what I have received. There is a place so dark, a darkness none of us can imagine, a darkness of people separated from land, separated from hope, separated from peace in a way none of us can imagine. And in that place, there are people lighting candles for peace. Right now, in that place, there are people teaching children to sing with one voice. In that place, there are people imagining a future beyond this. And we are invited to choose that story. Amen.